So unless you have any need for a clarification at this time, we move right ahead to the next presenter, who will give us the product developer perspective. It's Elliott Levy, who is from Amgen and is a senior vice president there in global development.
Hi, so my name's Elliott Levy, and I lead the clinical development organization at Amgen, which is responsible for advancing the pipeline of assets through phase 2 and 3 and developing new indications for marketed products. We're also responsible for non-interventional research. My colleague Brian Bradbury and I are going to speak to you for a few minutes today. I'm going to discuss the topic of aligning incentives from the perspective of a department head who enthusiastically supports the adoption of real-world evidence in product development. Brian will speak from the perspective of a working epidemiologist who works with and supports the product teams that develop our investigational medicines. Although we're both employed by Amgen, we're here today to represent the perspective of the professional product developer, not the company. I will say that we have no slides, so if you want to close your eyes for the next 20 minutes, and when the next speaker comes, we'll let you know. So there were a couple of phrases that Rachel Sherman used a few minutes ago that stuck with me. The first was Mythbusters, and I'll get to the second in a moment. The themes of this meeting are not just aligning incentives, but taking down disincentives and addressing barriers to change. And I think there may be, to me anyway, a myth that there are incentives, or perhaps perverse incentives, that are prompting us to continue to develop products in ways that are unnecessarily time-consuming and costly. I do believe that the existence of these incentives is a myth. What we feel quite acutely is the need to transform the way in which we develop medicinal products. Otherwise, the entire system of pharmaceutical innovation could suffer or cease to exist. And we're also, I think, acutely aware of the revolution in big data and the potential for big data to transform the process of healthcare and the potential for real-world data and real-world evidence, which is a part of big data. So many companies are addressing this challenge very aggressively. Companies are setting up digital health organizations, which are typically situated very high in the company, sometimes reporting to the CEO, which are tasked with leveraging big data to improve product development, the patient experience, patient outcomes, and value to the healthcare system. So drug developers working in these kind of environments who advocate for the use of real-world data do not encounter resistance from above, quite the contrary. We are already making extensive use of real-world data for the purpose of internal decision-making. And I was going to go through a list of the things we do, but I think that John Doyle's really covered them more eloquently than I could. I would just say that we're using big data extensively from end to end in the process of development and commercialization of our medicines. And increasingly, we see that real-world evidence and evidence from clinical trials are not in conflict with each other, but are really complementary sources of insight about our products that have important roles to play. And we also see, in fact, that the gap between these two types of evidence is closing. On the one hand, as we work to improve the rigor of real-world evidence, and on the other hand, oftentimes through the use of real-world data, we're improving the pragmatism and relevance of clinical trials, using real-world data, for instance, to take out unnecessary exclusion criteria that contribute nothing to the quality of the signal that the trial provides, or through the use of information from patients to simplify the trial design and make the interventions more like the interventions that the patients will experience in the clinic when the product comes to market, or adding patient-reported outcomes. So these sources of evidence and insights are, to some degree, converging on each other and have an important complementary role to play. But today, we're using real-world evidence primarily for internal decision-making. I think the aspiration for this meeting is to see real-world evidence replace clinical trial evidence and dramatically change the process of product development, and that is a big step. It's one that's very exciting for drug developers because it has the potential to address what we see as the fundamental challenge of drug development today, which is the extraordinary cost. with the revolution in genetics and the availability of large genetic data sets, we can identify promising therapeutic targets that couldn't be identified before. And with the ability to deploy new modalities like cellular therapies, gene therapies, we can interdict those targets more effectively than before. So we have, I think, more good ideas to pursue for new medicines. And what precludes us from pursuing most of them is simply the extraordinary cost of conducting large-scale clinical research. So the idea of replacing RCTs with RWE is very attractive to us. And while I don't think that there are disincentives to doing so or incentives to keeping the current model going, there are very significant barriers. I think that some of them have already been addressed today. And I'm not really going to talk about the barriers outside of our own organizations. What I thought I'd spend a moment talking about are the barriers that we face within our own organizations, because you won't hear about it from anybody else today. And I think they're relevant not only for us, but for anybody who runs a large organization. And so the first and most important of these barriers is the lack of knowledge and awareness. So the good ideas for real-world evidence generation have to come from our product teams. Our organizations are too decentralized. You hear me speak today, so you know that the ideas are not going to come from me. They have to come from the product teams, and those teams are led by physician scientists who are generally steeped in the randomized clinical trial model, who've benefited from the prestige and scientific cachet of the randomized clinical trial, and who have deep faith in it, and to some degree distrust for non-interventional methods. So what was illustrative to me in thinking about this problem is an experience I had a number of years ago. I had a product under review, a cardiovascular product. We were undergoing an inspection. The inspector was interested in looking at the study medication dosing record for this 18,000 patient cardiovascular megatrial and wanted to know why there was nothing in the case report form indicating the time of day on which the patient took the medicine. And I explained that in 18,000 patient trials, we typically didn't collect the time of dosing, nor was it necessary to do so. And the inspector patiently explained to me that they had spent 20 years working in a vivarium, conducting in vivo pharmacology studies. And there it was extremely important. In fact, if the rats didn't get the study drug at precisely the specified time, the data was uninterpretable. I had a very difficult time convincing the inspector to pivot and think about a different scientific framework than the one that they were accustomed to. And that's the challenge I think we face with our physician scientists, who are very accustomed to and comfortable working in this model. Now, there are a few other people on the product teams who can compensate for their lack of knowledge or insight. The product teams are staffed by individuals from medical and regulatory and operations and marketing. They typically don't know very much about real-world evidence either. So that's, I think, a first critical barrier for us. It's compounded by all the uncertainties around the actual deployment of real-world trials, uncertainties around their feasibility, timelines, cost, and then uncertainty around the regulatory framework and standards. A second critical challenge for us is talent and capabilities. Typically, there are relatively few individuals in these large organizations who have experience in conducting observational or non-interventional research. Some of them, they're generally epidemiologists. Some of them sit in the safety function, where they're most familiar with post-marketing surveillance. In some organizations, they sit in a health economics or outcomes group, where they're familiar with questions of value. Very few of them sit within development functions, where they can apply their understanding of non-interventional research to development questions. And then I think the third key issue is around systems and processes, which in our organizations have generally been optimized to generate evidence from randomized trials and not from non-interventional trials. So as a result, when we do bring forward ideas for non-interventional research, the trials are often overbuilt and more costly than they need to be, which makes them less attractive as alternatives to conventional clinical trials. So, the good news, I think, is that these barriers are all addressable. They're classical challenges that organizations face as they try to develop new ways of working or launch new products. We can take many steps to address them. Senior leadership like myself can take every opportunity to demonstrate our commitment and our interest to the adoption of real-world evidence. We can invest in training for many of our team members. We can continue to invest in our capabilities to acquire, manage, and analyze real-world data and develop fit-for-purpose processes for observational research. and we can address challenges in organizational structure. What is clear, and I think it's very clear from the presentation today, is that other barriers will remain which have to be addressed in order for us to fully exploit the opportunity to use real-world evidence in the regulatory setting. And those have been, I think, well described today, and I won't say anything further on them. I will yield the floor now to my colleague Brian Bradbury, who will talk about what he sees from the vantage point of someone who interacts day to day with the teams.